What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a lore video about the master of wizards, so to speak, Maxos. Who is Maxos? Well, that is an easy enough question to answer on a surface level, but details about the guy can be a little sparse. So there is only one game that Maxos is physically present in. There's only really two Divinity games that he's actually in, at all, including the one he's present in. And then there's one or two references to him in another game. Maxos is nonetheless a very important character in the early days of Rivellon, and Divinity 2, which is actually the latest game in the series of Divinity. With all that out of the way, I just want to mention that I have tons of lore videos about Divinity. I plan on making more of them for the entire series, not just Original Sin 2. And if you enjoy that content, you plan on watching more, I urge you to consider subscribing. The channel is growing tremendously, and it would mean a lot to me. With that out of the way, actually jumping into it here. I want to mention that I'm going to try my best to keep these events as chronological as possible. However, truth be told, outside of a couple instances, I don't have exact dates because the game is super vague when it comes to this guy. As far as exact times go, we know a lot about his more prominent events and things like that. We just don't necessarily know when exactly they happened, which is by design. But that said, Maxos is considered the greatest wizard of all time, basically. And the guy is the definition of lawful neutral. He is obsessed with knowledge of all things, basically, but specifically everything draconic. Maxos is actually the only non-dragon ever known to initiate a Dragon Knight. Dragon Knights, of course, being a member of a sentient race that can then be granted the form of a dragon. And I say lawful neutral because calling this guy good wouldn't necessarily be accurate. It's a well-known fact that in the Wizard Wars, which take place in a very broad portion of Divinity's history that is undocumented, there's 8,000 years or so, actually 9,000, between Dragon Commander and Original Sin that are basically unaccounted for outside of a few key dates. So the Wizard Wars kind of happened somewhere in that era. But Maxos was known to have not taken sides during that war, despite himself being a wizard. And the Wizard Wars were ultimately between wizards who went dark, shall we say, and started dealing with Chaos, the demon god, and then the wizards who weren't all about that life. Maxos stayed neutral in this. However, he actually was known to kill several members of the Black Ring, as well as members of this wizard cult of sorts that had popped up, or at least attempt to, because they got in his way of his search for knowledge about dragons and, wizardy magic stuff in general. Maxos will err on the side of good simply because it is advantageous to his research to do so. Calling him good wouldn't necessarily be accurate because he's not inclined to actually help in a bad situation, unless it can be seen to be an advantage for Maxos himself somehow. But because of that, he tends to err on the side of good simply because chaos and lawlessness don't tend to mix well with trying to perform orderly studies. The biggest source of information we have about Maxos actually comes from Divinity Dragon Commander, which is the only game he is physically present in. And essentially, in 8800 AD, again about 9,000 years before Original Sin 1, about 10,000 years before Original Sin 2, Maxos was part of an alliance with an Emperor Sigurd to peacefully unite all of Rivellon under one empire. Believe it or not, this actually succeeded. Emperor Sigurd actually controlled all of Rivellon at one time. However, at some point, a dragon actually came to his court, and Sigurd fell in love with her, and they birthed several children, who then later became corrupt. The protagonist of Dragon Commander is actually the Emperor's fourth child, which is you in that game. You are a human, we know that much, and it is implied that you're male, but honestly, the gender of this doesn't really matter. The important thing here is that Maxos took the fourth child to be born and hid it away, because the fourth child was actually, for whatever reason, seemingly a prime candidate to become a Dragon Knight, which Maxos then did, because again, remember, Maxos is all about dragons, and it's not mentioned that Maxos was specifically the person to initiate you here. To be clear, Dragon Knights were common enough during this era. The dragons themselves had retreated from society by this point, but they were still using Dragon Knights as their messengers to handle business throughout Rivellon. Now eventually, Emperor Sigurd is assassinated by his other three kids, who become corrupted by evil forces. Maxos comes to collect you so he can declare you emperor using his position in the alliance I mentioned earlier, and basically set you on the path to conquering your other 3 siblings as they try to take over Rivellon for themselves and whatever master it is they work for. We also are presented with the Raven. The Raven is an airship that Maxos had built around a demon named Corvus. Maxos had been magically stealing secrets from Corvus's mind and using them to foster all sorts of technology, which is why he was able to build the airship as well as a bunch of other technologies that are only seen in Dragon Commander and then destroyed at the end of the game. Now, Maxos' role in this is relatively small. Most of it is just the Dragon Knight protagonist helping secure the Empire from your half-siblings. But focusing on Maxos, most of what he does is simply keep Rivellon under control from falling into demonic hands, which would, of course, hinder his research. He also is the one that leads the destruction of all this tech. And after this, we don't hear from him from quite some time as far as confirmed lore goes. In fact, the only real mention is that in Divinity Original Sin, we know 2 things. We know that he is responsible for imprisoning Belegar in the cave you can find in Act 1. Belegar is a rhyming mage that is incredibly annoying. And for whatever reason, Maxos got tired of his nonsense and magically sealed in a cave. We also know that in Original Sin, sometimes when mages and things are casting spells in combat, they will invoke Maxos' name as they do it. And then, the only other mention is in Divinity 2. So keep in mind, Divinity 2 takes place 10,100 years after Dragon Commander. We do learn a lot about Maxos here, but it's all secondhand. Maxos has disappeared. No one knows where he went. Now, I will say, again, this is part of the timeline problem I mentioned earlier. His disappearance, I would say, is likely to have happened before 1218, because that is when Lucian ascended to divinity. And nothing in Lucian's history or timeline seems to confirm him even knowing about Maxos. But given his position as the divine, it's likely he would have known him, but it seems unlikely that Maxos, being this incredibly powerful wizard, would have just not interacted with Lucian at all. But, moving on. In Divinity 2, we learn that Maxos was, again, initiating Dragon Knights at this point. So somewhere in between Dragon Commander and, again, probably 1218, he definitely became the chief person that was initiating Dragon Knights. He also controlled the Battle Tower. The Battle Tower is a very interesting area, which I might do its separate lore video on, but it seems to be connected to dragons very intrinsically somehow. The magic on the island is often seen as draconic, and it's here from the Battle Tower that he seemingly kept all of the Dragon Knights under him in check, because throughout Divinity 2, we actually get to speak to a number of Dragon Knights of yesteryear, shall we say, that Maxos at one time granted a sort of barony, control over certain areas. And after they basically completely failed in this task and became tyrants, Maxos cursed them and saw to their punishment, which you get to see firsthand in Divinity 2. That is the punishment itself, not actually Maxos punishing them. Because part of the main story of Divinity 2 is actually that you need to find a spell that Maxos is known to have made, which is a spell that will actually take its user to the Hall of Echoes. This is a big deal. Typically speaking, dragons are the only people who can enter the Hall of Echoes at will. Maxos, however, was able to make a spell that would get it done. It needed, typically though, a dragon's touch, shall we say. They basically had to help you find a rift to the Hall of Echoes first, which is obviously going to be a big deal for anyone who isn't Maxos. Now, sometime after this spell was written, like I mentioned, Maxos just disappears, probably before the year 1218. Again, Divinity 2 takes place in 1300 AR. And it's hard to say what happened to him, but he made this Hall of Echoes spell, and then the dude just dipped out. No one's seen him since. But unfortunately, they again don't give us exact dates for that. However, I think it's safe to say that he found his way to the Hall of Echoes, and he went there, and then who knows what happened to him after that. But there you go, guys. That is all the lore I could piece together on an interesting character in the Divinity series that honestly didn't get any love in Original Sin 2. And I hope Larian, if they ever make another Divinity game, has some plans for adding this guy in, because he's so detached from the current arc they're working on that I think they could work him in much like they did a lot of the lore that Original Sin 2 added without really messing up anything, just kind of adding to it. And I think it would be really cool to see. So, thank you so much for watching this, especially if you made it this far. I have a bunch of other lore videos on the Divinity series if you want to check those out. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.